26 years ago in 1997, a very special video game was thrust into the market. It was a video game that was going to change the gaming habits of many gamers across the Western Hemisphere, and that game was Final Fantasy VII. Now, ever since, I have been following the Final Fantasy franchise because I'm looking for that next Final Fantasy VII. I have played the spin-offs, I have played the mainline games, and now we have Final Fantasy XVI, the latest in the Final Fantasy mainline games. But what did I think of it? Well, if you want to find out, it's coming right up, right after these.
Now I do like to start a review by looking at the graphics, because let's face it, the first bite with video games is most definitely with the eyes. And when it comes to the graphics of Final Fantasy XVI, well, they're quite simply something to behold, but not always in a good way, but I'll get to that later. Now, throughout all the marketing hype for this game, and even right through to the early demo release, Square Enix most definitely made a point of highlighting the spectacular graphics that they'd put together for this game. And if you haven't played the game yet, then the graphics are in fact spectacular. Well, spectacular in places, as I alluded to before. These spectacular graphics, however, seem to be reserved only for big set pieces, and throughout the game there will be enough of these set pieces to keep your eyes sated. Unfortunately, despite the graphics being raised to these giddy heights, especially in icon battles, when it comes down to some of the more humdrum and run-of-the-mill parts of the game, the graphics take a serious dip indeed. I dare say that some of the textures don't even look as good as top-tier PlayStation 3 textures. So if you were hoping for Final Fantasy XVI to win on graphics alone, I'm afraid you're probably going to be sorely disappointed, as the graphics in the game will swing quite dramatically from the sublime and superb to the downright bland and boring. But worse than this, the juxtaposition between the sublime and the utterly dull is likely to draw you out of the game and break that feeling of immersion that they were hopefully aiming for when they put all the time and effort into, well, where they put the time and effort in. And to give a numeric rating to the graphics in Final Fantasy XVI, well, it's quite easily a 6. And not because it's a 6 from start to finish when it comes to the graphics, it's all down to the disparity between the fantastic to the obviously phoned in parts that they just didn't seem to care about. But of course, graphics do not maketh the game, as I have said time and time again, so let's move on to the sound. Now, I'll happily throw my hands up because both sound design and music is not exactly my forte. It's not that I don't appreciate good sound design, and it's not that I don't enjoy music, it's just that when it comes to the technicalities of such things, I have no experience whatsoever. So what I'll focus on here is how the sound design and music made me feel personally. And as it's probably the more important part, let's start with the sound design. And yes, I'm happy to say that the sound design within Final Fantasy XVI is perfectly adequate, although not without its issues too. There were, for example, a few parts of the game where your main character was walking from one surface to another and the sound didn't change. Now, that might not seem like a big deal to you, but even for someone like me who has an ear that's not that experienced, this did come across a little bit jarring in places. Again, like the graphics, when the standards occasionally or quite often dip, this really can break the sense of immersion. Again, as with the graphics when it came to the cinematic sections of the game, or as I like to think of them as, the parts of the game where Square Enix actually put the time and effort in. The quality was obviously of a much higher standard, and all this would seem to do was highlight the parts where they didn't put as much time and effort in. Now, you can't talk about a modern RPG sound without talking about voice acting, but I'm glad to report that on the whole the voice acting throughout the game is top notch. Now, you may perceive it slightly differently depending on who you are and more importantly where you come from, because the voice actors used for the game are all from England, and not just one place in England, but from the whole range of accents that you will come across if you ever visit England yourself. Now, I did say that the voice acting is top notch, and I will stand by that. For me personally, however, being from the British Isles, hearing the wide range of English accents and dialects did kind of throw me from time to time. Now, that That's not to say that they were using dialects that I don't like or appreciate, but being a UK gamer, or a gamer probably anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, hearing accents that are much closer to home and not from North America did take a little while to get used to. Some of the places where the voice acting did fail, however, was not down to the actor themselves, but more down to the character design chosen for each particular voice. Now, for many of the performances, the faces matched the voice and there was no issue whatsoever, but every now and again you would get a rather old voice coming from a young face, or vice versa. And again, it's this lack of attention to some of the finer details, especially outside the cinematic parts of the game, that broke the immersion for me and chipped away at the overall rating that I was going to give this game. The final part of the holy trinity of sound when it comes to video games is the score itself, the music that plays throughout the game. And for me, this is where Final Fantasy XVI probably shines the most. There are of course large swathes of original soundtracks, stuff that we haven't experienced before in Final Fantasy games, but of course, as with most Final Fantasy games, it is absolutely littered with nods to the past. There are some absolutely wonderful arrangements of classic Final Fantasy music littered from start to finish, and despite only having one playthrough and not focusing too much on the music or sound at all for that matter, if there was one thing that would draw me back into playing this game for a second time, it would most definitely be the music. And that's simply for the sense of nostalgia that it managed to deliver. Now, as I said before, when it comes to sound and music, that's not where my experience really comes to shine. But that doesn't mean that I don't appreciate the music or that I can't put any sort of rating on it. As with other art forms that I'm not too well versed in, I do know what I like, and this was something that I most certainly liked. As for me, it was the most Final Fantasy thing about this entire Final Fantasy game. And if I was to give a numeric rating to the sound design, the music and everything else oral, then it would definitely be a nice solid 8 out of 10, as I could quite happily sit down and just listen to this game's soundtrack. But it's about time now that we got down to gameplay, and that is the meat and potatoes of any review as far as I'm concerned, because despite whatever graphics or wonderful soundtracks you throw at a game, the gameplay itself is king, so here's my thoughts on that. Now, being a Final Fantasy game, you're safe to assume that this game here will be an RPG, and more specifically a JRPG. And when it comes to JRPGs, there are certain conventions that you do expect. So to discuss the gameplay, I'm going to break it down into 4 different sections: traversal and exploration, environmental interaction, levelling and gear, and of course, combat mechanics. So sticking to that order, I'm going to start with traversal and exploration. Now, when it comes to JRPGs, traditionally anyway, there are a few ways that you can handle traversal and exploration. For a Final Fantasy game, you do kind of expect some sort of open world environment, and dare I say, an open world that slowly reveals itself to you throughout the course of the game. So how does Final Fantasy XVI fit into these preconceptions? And quite simply, it doesn't at all. For reasons beyond my ken at least, Square Enix have decided to follow the same path as they did with Stranger of Paradise and take away the open world free-roaming exploration mechanics that we saw in, well, most other Final Fantasy games, and have lumbered us once again with a map. Now, not a map that you pull up to see where you are in the open world, a map that you pull up to decide where you want to go within it. Now, although this is not unheard of in JRPGs through history, it is however something that was much more prevalent in previous generations where the power wasn't there to give a big expansive open world. And it's not that I don't enjoy a good dungeon crawling RPG, it's just that in 2023 I do expect a bit more when it comes to role-playing games these days. Now, some people might argue that it is to a certain degree open world, due to the fact that most of the dungeons are situated outdoors and of course they are fairly expansive. The inability, however, just to jump on your chocobo and ride to another area in the map really does strip back on the immersion that they were hoping for, or at least I would have thought they were hoping for. Now, it could be that the graphical fidelity that they managed to cram into the icon battles take up so much room and space that having a truly open world was something that they just couldn't deliver upon. But going back to the fact that the graphics aren't quite consistent when it comes to how spectacular they are, makes me think this was more of a deliberate thought than just what they had to do. And once you're in the world, well, it is fairly empty and not very well lived in, which leads nicely onto environmental interactions. So yes, we do have fairly large, expansive outdoor dungeons to explore. But what exactly are in these dungeons when we get to explore them? And the real shame is that there's pretty much nothing, whereas some other current games, and I will mention here the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, also have very large and expansive maps that are fairly empty. There always seems to be something new and interesting to do wherever you wind up on that particular map. With Final Fantasy XVI, it just seems like an open, empty space that you have to cross to get to whatever your next destination is. And I have no doubt that the developers knew this was the case because there's fast travel points all over these mini dungeons anyway. So basically, once you've been to a location, you never need to travel to that location again without using fast travel. And to be quite frankly honest, you're not going to want to anyway. Now that's not to say that the dungeons in Final Fantasy XVI are completely devoid of action. It just seemed to me that they were pointless fluff that had no real impact on the game. One little throwback to previous Final Fantasy games was the bringing back of the hunts. Back at your home base, the hideaway, you have access to a notice board which will display a list of legendary beasts which you can go out and hunt and kill. As I said, this is a nod to previous Final Fantasies, but in this case it just seems like it's been added on for nothing more than just a little bit of filler. And if you discover for yourself that that is all purely fluff, you just wait until you encounter the NPCs. Now I have been informed that back in the day the NPCs in Final Fantasy games didn't do very much at all, but to be fair to the previous games, that was pretty much down to the technology that the games were developed for. The amount of storage they had, how much RAM they had access to, and of course just the sheer processing power of what they were developed for. In a game in 2023, however, I do expect my NPCs to do a little bit more than just stand and do nothing. And in Final Fantasy XVI, that's exactly what they do for the majority of the time. Now they will have some dialogue, but it will be one line of dialogue that will be repeated over and over and over again every time you pass that particular NPC. And if there was one thing that was just a little bit more jarring than the NPCs that just stood stock still and never moved throughout huge portions of the game, would be the occasional NPC who was just pacing up and down, and I don't mean deep in thought, wondering what he was doing in such a lackluster RPG, but literally just walking from wall to wall in a never-ending cycle. And the further I went on with the gameplay, the more and more I realised that there is just nothing much to it at all. Which takes us to levelling up, and of course gear. Now to say Final Fantasy XVI has light RPG mechanics does a disservice to light RPG games. And of all the mainline Final Fantasy games that I've had the privilege to play, I have never experienced anything so threadbare as the RPG mechanics when it comes to Final Fantasy XVI. Regardless of how much you grind the game, nothing really seems to change out with the scope of the general direction of the story. I personally noticed no real impact to my gameplay experience by taking on every side quest, and let me tell you, the side quests in Final Fantasy XVI are fetch quests and maybe go and take out a bunch of bandits and nothing more than that, so you're maybe going to want to avoid them if you do play the game. And as for acquiring and equipping new gear, you're probably going to want to not get too invested in the idea of that, because the gear that you get in the game is again threadbare. There's no substantial upgrade path for your gear, and when you do upgrade the gear, it tends to be story driven as well. And actually, the more I talk about and think about this game, the only thing that seems to have been on the mind of the developers is the icon battles and what you gain from them, and that is a very linear progression that doesn't really befit a Final Fantasy game. So not very good traversal exploration, environmental interaction is pretty poor, and levelling in gear is pretty threadbare. So what about the combat? Surely that lifts this JRPG above the rest. Well, I would like to think so, but unfortunately even the combat in Final Fantasy XVI falls really short of what makes a good Final Fantasy game. Actually, I would go as far as to say its combat doesn't do service to any RPG. Now I will throw my hands up, be frankly honest, that when it comes to combat, especially in an RPG and a JRPG, I do love turn-based. And yes, I know that's not everyone's cup of tea. Some people do like a bit of action when it comes to their combat in role-playing games. But historically, Final Fantasy has always produced its best games when it's been turn-based combat. And for the developers to completely strip this back from Final Fantasy XVI is nothing less than a travesty to me. If of course you're a fan of Devil May Cry and its frenetic, fast-paced, flashy, over-the-top combat, then you're probably going to enjoy this. It's probably going to introduce you to the Final Fantasy world and put a smile on your face. I think, however, for the typical RPG fan, we're looking for something with a bit more depth, especially when it comes to the combat. Sure, I could happily discard of having multiple sets of gear and being able to upgrade them multiple times as long as the combat is slow, thoughtful and very well crafted. It's a frantic, fast-paced button masher of a combat system and it just didn't gel with me at all. And then, just to add a little bit more confusion, once you go into an icon battle, when you transform yourself into a Freet and take on the other icons, it becomes a cinematic QTE battle. And I think it's a disservice again to call this a QTE because you get maybe 1 or 2 actions over the course of 5 or so minutes. And again, I'll point out, it just looks like the developers have put all their focus onto how wonderful these icon battles look and have disregarded the rest of what makes a great JRPG. So the rating that I'm going to give the gameplay for Final Fantasy XVI is 6 out of 10, and I think I'm probably being a bit over generous there. Now, of course, another important aspect of any RPG, be it a Western made RPG or a Japanese role-playing game, is of course the story. We play these games mostly for the story. And whether that be environmentally told like in most Western RPGs, or a well-crafted narrative that has many twists and turns and intersecting narrative threads that we tend to see in JRPGs, the story is just as vital as the gameplay. So how is the story in Final Fantasy XVI? So let me try to break it down to you without too many spoilers. I will try that. So the story is about this young prince, and it's about how his life was completely transformed, turned upside down you might say. You see, in West Rosaria, he was born and raised, and on the training ground was where he spent most of his days, learning to fence and casting some magic, and doing his princely things about the courtyard. No, wait a minute, I'm thinking Fresh Prince of Bel-Air there. No, the story when it comes to Final Fantasy XVI is one of the most linear stories I have ever seen in a JRPG, and more especially so when it comes to a Final Fantasy game. You take control of the main protagonist, that is Clive, the young prince from Rosaria. He gets betrayed, he loses his brother, he loses his kingdom, and he gets cast out into the wilderness. While out there he does stumble across a group of outlaws who take him in, and eventually he will go on to lead this group of outlaws. And not only lead them, he will kind of raise them like an army and grow his home base. Now this is starting to sound really like Suikoden, but unfortunately, unlike Suikoden, that's where the similarities with these two games end. Suikoden has this wonderful rich story that is so big that you won't experience it the first time you play it through, you won't experience it all in the 10th time you play it through. With Final Fantasy XVI, it's a very linear story. You're going from point A to point B, and that is it. The NPCs and even your party members who come in from time to time and swap out, although you do not control them in the game, I must point that out, have very little to offer the game when it comes to the narrative. And the story beats are quite simply going from one icon battle to the next icon battle until you get to the very end and beat the final boss. As stories and even as characterisation goes, this is without a doubt the weakest of all the Final Fantasy games I have ever played. And there may be a sharp intake of breath from a few of you out there when I state this, but Final Fantasy VIII is head and shoulders above Final Fantasy XVI in just about every department. So yes, no spoilers because there's no real story, and the rating that I would give the story for Final Fantasy XVI is 5 out of 10. So to quickly summarise, Final Fantasy XVI is not a JRPG and it's barely an RPG of any kind. It has a threadbare storyline, the side characters are very uninspired with very little depth. It has very flashy but unsubstantial combat, very little thought has been put into environmental storytelling, and outside the icon battles has very little to offer. And even that is all just show. My advice to you is not to play Final Fantasy XVI, but pick one of the aspects that you like for it and look for the better game. If you like the look of the combat, just play the Devil May Cry games. If you're drawn to the huge boss battles, then just play a Soulsborne. And if you're looking for a story about a young prince who's cast out, becomes an outlaw, raises an army and fights for justice, then just play Suikoden 1 or 2. Because Final Fantasy XVI is not only not just a JRPG, it's not even a Final Fantasy game, despite all the fan service that is shoveled down your throat. But I will give it a rating out of 10, and I'm going to give it 2 ratings out of 10. I'm going to give it 7 out of 10 for an action adventure game, but as a Final Fantasy game, it's no more than a 5 out of 10, and that's me being generous again.
So there you go, my friends, that was Final Fantasy XVI and my thoughts on that absolute shambles of a game. Now don't get me wrong, you might love the game because the reviews out there are a bit on the mixed side. There's people stating it is one of the best games I've ever played, and there's people like me thinking it should be buried deep down in the core of the earth where it will never be found again. Now of course, if you want to talk about this game, then drop down into the comments. The interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes YouTube special. It does for me anyway. And if you want to see any more from Generation Pixel, then I'll pop a couple of boxes up here and here for devices that support such things, and you can watch some other videos that you may be interested in. But mostly, thank you again for watching as always, and until next time, cheerio!